Welcome to AdTech Osmosis. Today I have a very special guest, a friend and a mentor of mine, Andy Russo. And Andy is one of the deans of database marketing, marketing science, goes back to the very early days of database marketing, and really how to apply it to business strategy. And of course, he's one of those people who never, stops innovating. And so now, after all these years, he's become personally involved in machine learning, data science, and sort of the new age of digital marketing, and does a lot of that by hand. So, Andy, I'd like to welcome you to our channel. This is a young channel, and I want to have people here, who really got both the experience, but also the hunger to innovate, because I think that in our digital space, which has seen a lot of technology and venture capital come in the last 10, 12 years, there's a tendency to try to pick the mediocre solution versus the excellent solution that's caused a lot of mediocrity and commoditization, and ultimately a lot of people have paid the price, namely shareholders.
hmm
But our background, I just want to kind of give a history of kind of how we got together. I met you when I was, I think, 24 years old, and I had just gotten into, database marketing, and you happened to be my boss, and neither one of us knew each other the day before. But for whatever reason, I think you figured out that I probably had the intuitive ability to do this kind of stuff and took me under your wing. And this was in the days of database marketing in the direct mail world, which, by the way, is still significant, and direct mail is making a comeback.
hmm
And we were applying it in the financial services space. And one of the interesting things I think I recall from those days, and having kind of done predictive science in a number of different fields, including econometrics, is that I think that in terms of human brain power, a lot of the stuff that we were doing in database marketing and direct mail in those days was more challenging than I would say 97% of what is presented as very, very sophisticated in the machine learning world. And the reason I say that is that in the machine learning world, a lot of it is just brute force, running, crunching data through a server and hoping that you get to something called statistical significance, which isn't really statistical significance. So in any case, as the old cliche goes, there's a lot of the onion to peel back here. But I want to kind of just set you up to give us a perspective on, really what you've seen in and around marketing science and strategy for the last several decades. And I recall when we first met, I'd read an article that you wrote, and I think you wrote it in 1990. And if I have it correctly, I think it was marketing should have the urge to merge with IT. And that really is prophetic because that is still the need of the hour, and yet for whatever reason, it hasn't happened. And as I mentioned, and I think you've probably seen this more than I certainly, that there is a tendency to want to play it safe and go for the mediocre. So with that, I'd like you to tell us about your background, kind of what you've seen. And I know that one of the interesting things is that we went to the same MBA school at Babson College, and that is where you were inspired to get into database marketing. So with that, Andy, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Sunil, and it's nice to spend a little bit of time with you after all these years, and I'm certainly glad that you realized you could learn through osmosis. It's a little joke that if he wants to, he can say. So it's interesting. Back when I was a young man and getting my MBA, we had to take coursework in business forecasting. And I really took a liking to it. There was something cool about trying to forecast where the economy was going and looking at things of that nature. But it also struck me, while I was employed full time by a company called New England Life in Boston, now it's part of MetLife, there was some challenges in marketing. And putting two and two together while in class, I asked the professor, if we're sitting here trying to understand and forecast where the economy is going, why can't we predict who might buy something? And in particular, I had in mind, how do we break the traditional way of marketing and life insurance, which at the time was let's send out a whole bunch of free Rand McNally roadmaps, and those became leads. And so certainly the seniors loved to get free things, and they would eat those up in troves. but you didn't really get any solid leads from those or qualified responses. And I felt like if we could really look at the book of business and what really happened, perhaps I could build one of these models and see what happened. And when I first introduced that to the executive team, they weren't interested. In fact, they called me a mad scientist and threatened me, with my job if, and said maybe some other time. And, that was kind of the traditional way of thinking. We'd rather not take risks. We'll do things the way they are. They've served us well for 100 some odd years because the company was founded in something like 1865. But as luck would have it, when we started to do some of this, the economy was starting to turn and they were freaking out because the business was falling. And that gave me an opportunity to say, hey, let's give this a try. And I did, and to make a long story short, it worked really well. In fact, they built a whole department around it later and gave it a budget and all those sorts of things. So that's basically how I got my start way back before anyone, had even a term. At the time they started to call it database marketing. Now there's, data science and big data, which, the jury's out on what exactly data science means. I have my own opinion, and that's very biased given my history. So, that's how I got my start. And what I have found is things really haven't changed. Certainly technology's changed, so that allows you to do more. But the fundamentals of what you're trying to achieve, which is solve a business problem, haven't changed. And data hasn't changed. There's more of it, but basically it hasn't changed, nor has modeling. Sure, there's neural nets and things of that, but regression analysis has been used, I think, back since the 50s. So that isn't new either, and that's a form of machine learning. So what's really changed then, or how do we fast forward, and what does today mean? I mean, somewhere in between, and there's a lot of years in between, obviously, you can see by my gray hair. I've done a ton of different projects in a ton of different industries, and it's always the same thing. So I'll go back to the article that Sunil referenced. And in today's world, as it was some 20 plus years ago, we still have a problem with the business executives. Mine might be marketing, but it could be operations, could be anything. Doesn't quite understand what IT does and vice versa. And IT is really good at delivering a project at the time that they said they would, even if it's not what you asked for. And that doesn't help anybody. And Sunil laughed because he's experienced it. And that continues today. And so, that's a problem that even with all this technology, there's a lot of people out there, that are touting data science and all these miracle solutions. But the problem is you still have the business owner and IT not communicating, IT not really understanding it's a service arm and it's there to serve the business owner. And so, what do you do to solve that? So we'll get to some of that a little bit later. But my perspective has been for every project I've ever done, the biggest failing seems to be, the quality of the data. Usually dump the data on the lap, let them figure it out. And that means a couple of things. First of all, it shows that IT doesn't really understand. It shows the business owner doesn't really understand. So the onus is on me to pull my learnings from Babson, the business acumen I got through the years and the learnings I got there, and basically figure it out for them. That's not really a good place to be. It's a good place to be for me. But if I'm the executive, that's not a good place to be. And so, we'll talk about that later because I know that's something you want to get to about what can business leaders do.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I think the way you've essentially set this up is that the more things change, the more they stay the same. We come up with new buzzwords. Now, if I can distill what's happening, I think right now in terms of not just ad tech, but these platform economies in general. And, within 3 months of getting into this space, which was about 10 years ago, I had written a paper that said this is a market for lemons. But the difference, I think, is that 30 or 40 years ago, venture capital was not driving the economy as much as it is, at least not the growth
Mhm.
portion of the economy.
Right.
And so, as an organization, as a large corporation, you had the ability to think in terms of a sustainable, business model, even if the executives weren't necessarily intuiting what had to happen on the innovation side. But the way that I think the venture capital game is played is you essentially just create uh, a, a category and create buzz in that category, and thereby you create velocity. And then you just want to move capital into that space. You want to keep it as narrow and linear as possible, and hope you're one of the salmon that kind of makes it at the end.
Right.
There isn't much in the way of strategic pricing, thinking about your product differentiation in those terms, and so on. We could go on ad nauseum.
Hmm.
And so what has happened in ad tech is that essentially a new version of the ad server came along, and that became the bidder. And this whole economy developed around that, and a few demand side platforms, which I think have done a great job to provide us that foundation, built this industry in that regard. And then everybody else was pretending that they had their own stuff, but it was some derivative of these core
Yeah.
technologies. And so what has happened is that inertia took over, and now all the way back to the marketer, you have VPs of tech who really don't intuit anything that's going on. And so it's a murky space where unless you're one of the people who has really built something, unfortunately, we built an optimization company and a second optimization company have powered some of these platforms behind the scenes. But the challenge then becomes when you understand kind of the angles that those chess pieces can take, it becomes very difficult to actually put that in front of other executives in a large organization. I've got experience in a couple of large companies in the space, and I'll leave them nameless. So you mentioned you were called a mad scientist. My favorite comment I've gotten was that I lacked intellectual weight. And that lack of intellectual weight, by the
Whoever
way,
said that doesn't know you.
right. And that's a good thing. And that lack of intellectual weight then over the years has become the programmable bidder and so on. And so bringing this now to what I see in terms of the specific data science issues, because there are many issues in data science, but if we break down an analytical problem, one way of breaking it down is you have your data aggregation, which is putting it together, and you've gotten into Python now because there are some lazy engineers who can't do that for whatever reason in various companies. But you've got to aggregate the data so that it's ready. And then you've got to do the analysis, then you've got to distribute the analysis, then you've got to create a feedback loop. That's essentially what the end-to-end of data science is. In this space, what happened in the beginning was because algorithms were being used in a not very intelligent way, the wrong kind of data was being analyzed. So as I study the problem, there was the curated audience segment, which was essentially crawlers would put on websites and certain audience behavior, quote unquote, was collected, and this was put into databases, which later became data management platforms.
Hmm.
And this is what the third-party data model was all about, and it was always destined to fail because you couldn't really activate it in a integrated way with other variables at the point of activation. You always talked, even in the old days, about it's a multivariate. It's the relationship among variables. So if I have three variables and I know the sensitivity of each, that is not nearly as effective as knowing their relative sensitivity and then doing
Yep.
variable things, right? So in any case, the central issue was that the real data, the real predictive data, which is the log data, which was coming out of devices, which is where people are interacting with the digital properties, that was just being sent into EC2 instances. And the engineers were telling me that it's a distraction to focus on that, but of course it wasn't. That's where the predictive power has been, and we've proven that. But the trouble is that although you could figure out the algorithmic part of that, and that did require some new innovations in data science, because the activation pathways had been built around a simplistic way of doing data analysis, we've had a situation in this industry where it's like you want to move an oil tanker, but you have a little country stream. So your infrastructure is improperly designed. And so then we started to argue over the years that, look, these bidding platforms have to open up their infrastructure. And so, of course, prior to being told I lacked intellectual weight, I was also told that's just a DMP. That's fine. And then we started to give away some IP along the way. And now there are two or three entities in the space who do provide real programmable bidders. And specifically, what that means is that in order to really predict what's going on with audiences to the best of your ability in this particular space and do it at the campaign level, so you can optimize your site, you can optimize your paid media and your own media, you've got to create combinations of data. And so those combinations of data, when properly created, end up in the 10,000, the 100,000, 200,000 range, not 8 or 10 variables.
Right.
And so,
I'm
although
glad you said that.
although right, and now that you're in it,
Yeah.
So although the specifics are all, and the specifics always matter because that's the chess game, the fundamentals remain the same. And I think that the next 10 years is going to be less of a revolution of wasting capital. I think it's going to have to be more of an evolution. And we're starting to see this. Some of the large brands are starting to actually look at this. But there's a myth. There's a myth that only very large brands like Procter and Gamble can have first-party data activation and optimization and not be totally reliant on Google. This is, again, a misunderstanding because if you take back that exhaust, which is the log data, and you curate it properly and create a feedback loop, that is available to every single marketer in the world. And what ad tech will have to do is we'll have to figure out a business model that can provide this capability to the SMB. And when this happens, then the holding companies will fast follow just as they did the original innovation, in my view.
Yeah.
So your thoughts on that, Andy?
Yeah, I mean, I started to intercede a little bit because I hear this all the time. A good model is 5 to 8 variables, and yet, and here's what I explained, and I contributed to an article recently in the South Florida Business Journal, and it basically went something along these lines that unless you're capturing every little environmental factor that enters our brain that impacts the decision we're making. We may just be having a bad day, so all of a sudden we're not going to buy that box of cornflakes that we went to the market for, right? Our mind is somewhere else. So you can't tell me for a moment, nor do I believe in all my work, that's we limit it to that. So you heard me back whenever. It's way more. And a lot of the models I do now, especially if I'm doing stochastic gradient boosting, which is decision tree and all this sort of stuff, in AI, everything gets scored, right? There's synapse weights on everything. And I think all those things are important. So if I really want to get a good view, and I have hundreds of variables, and what I typically will do is I may start off with some client gives me 50 variables. By the time I'm done, I probably have 500 variables up fabricated for that because I want to get into the real granular stuff. Yeah. And it's when you dig into those weeds that you start to see things that you're not going to find in 5 to 8 variables. And the brainiacs are going to argue with me to the day they die because that's what they learned in college. But I'm sitting there saying that's not how the brain works. And what we're trying to do, and you've heard me say this about marketing is all about trying to evoke an emotion, and hopefully that emotion is to do something you want them to do. And how the hell can you say that I can pick those 5 things and that's what they're going to do? I think if I pick those 200 things, I'm going to get even closer. If I pick those 500 factors, I'm going to get right, very close to being spot on. So that's how I look at it. And I'm sure there's people out there waiting to get at me for what I just said. But I've built a ton of models. They've been successful in the market. And trust me, some of those have hundreds of variables in them because it's looking at everything. And that's really what I learned at Babson. When we were doing econometric forecasting, at that time, there were probably dozens of variables, and that was unheard of back then. But isn't that what drives the economy? Again, it's people's emotions. We're seeing it now. The pandemonium that's out there, right? Yeah. But that impacts the market. So why on earth would you not capture that as an event?
Yeah, it's very interesting because it's the trade-off between the academics want a model that's going to work for everything always for the next 18 months. And look, there's a reason for that. And I've studied econometrics. I understand that if you can get data that's in a stable environment where it will never change or it won't change for the time period that you're building a model makes sense. You can fit a linear curve. But there's an old saying, it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white. If it catches mice, it's a good cat.
That's right.
And,
That's
and
the
so
objective.
that's it.
That's my point. That's the objective.
And so in the marketing world, there is a trade-off when you put lots of model, and you know there are two trade-offs. One is you can limit the number of variables, but you can create combinations to kind of, and then you can add more variables. Now, look, there will be trade-offs to that model. It won't be as stable over 18 months. But if I can refresh it every week and repredict it down to the campaign level, what do I care? And so I had one of these. I happened to be at one of these events and in Boston because I somehow am in the AI world, I guess. And somebody who's a professor at one of the prominent schools, let's say in the Boston area, I won't name, was pooping all over non-parametric statistics. And I hadn't said anything. I said, by the way, uh, it works, but it works under these limits. But when you apply it under these limits, it works better than anything else in this space. Now he bought it, so I give him credit.
Hmm.
But I think this is where we really want to get to. What we're really talking about is innovation, and we're talking about research and development. And if you're going to do research and development, you can't be closed off. You've got to componentize your platform, and you've got to say, here's some budget. You just go experiment, because genius doesn't happen every single day. Now, what is happening in this space is that somebody said this to me, and I think it was a brilliant line. They said that the investment bankers are basically, in a way, holding people hostage, coercing. It's a form of coercion where they're going to, for example, these big holding companies and others who don't have innovation in-house and saying, because the environment is changing so quickly, R&D is no longer available and you have to simply acquire. Now, I think about that and I say, look, if you have a highly innovative company that can be acquired, now if Google, Amazon, or IBM acquires it, it's going to perform in one way. But if that same company is acquired by a holding company which doesn't have its own innovation process, it's not going to perform, assuming that they can even make the right decision, which is questionable if you don't have the intuition, because ultimately it's about intuition. And that's where, so our approach is, look, let's try to provide R&D in a box. But I want your thoughts on research and development, because, look, and this is a loaded statement because I'm saying it right at the beginning. I'm saying
Yeah.
research and development is your golden goose. And how can you kill the golden goose? But what are your thoughts on, yes, it's a fast changing world. Yes, research and development is no longer the same. Yes, you can't just put a tremendous amount of capital in it for 18 months and have it do the same thing. Yes, there's more competition, but there has to be a way forward.
Yeah, I mean that is an interesting question, and one I can't say I've spent a lot of time thinking about. Maybe because I was in the middle of it and never realized that's what I was doing, but I was, and it always came down to, you know, an idiot could and I like to say that idiots can, do very well being copycats. In some aspects, there's nothing wrong with it. You're going to make money, but that's not interesting to me. It's always been interesting to finding ways of doing things or discovering things that work that no one else really thought about. I mean, that's competitive advantage. That's what we learned at Babson, right? So I've always thought about competitive advantage, and competitive advantage requires R&D, right? And, lately I've stumbled on something, that in the statistics world is a no-no, and that's called outliers, right? Outliers are problems. You have to eliminate them. Well, what does that do? It brings you to the average. And when I speak at conferences, and you'll like this, and I don't know if I used to say this back in the day, but I'd ask the crowd, like, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about algebra and some
Yeah.
basic statistics, and don't be afraid. But I'd ask the first question, how do you calculate an average? And no one wanted to give me the answer in case they were wrong.
Because they
But I'd
thought it was a
say,
trick question.
yeah, it's a trick question. But I'd say, and I'd use my hands like an Italian would, isn't it a bunch of high numbers and a bunch plus a bunch of low numbers? You add them all up and divide by whatever, you get an average, right? I said, well, what happens if you take some of those low numbers out?
Yeah.
And they weren't thinking that way. So my whole thing is, well, how do I really see what's going on? And recently, I did a project for an online casino, and I didn't remove the outliers. Why? Because the outliers were the high rollers. I want more of them. So I
Yeah.
want to isolate them, and I want to go deep into them as a segment and find out more about them. And that requires, adding some data and finding and fabricating data to find out more about them. And in that aspect, that's kind of R&D, not on, whole technology, but on a concept that says, I'm breaking away from traditional thinking because there's something out there that bears investigating, and that may take retooling how I might address a model or my technology so that I don't inadvertently remove something that actually turns out to be really important to that client. And so what you're trying to do is the same thing. If I take in all of this and I don't gravitate to the middle, right, which is just being average and who wants to be a C student, but apparently many companies, and I understand VCs, right, because they're about taking risk, but they're really not, because what they're really doing is making a play on 10 companies kind of doing the same thing and hoping one of them wins. And if you throw an outlier out there, and that's really what we're talking about, even for investment, we throw an outlier out there, and that's like such an outrageous thing that they start calling us names, Sunil, then
Yeah.
we're on to something and they're afraid.
Yeah. Well, that's because
So
we're outliers on the right side. But
yeah, but
but
so that's what wherever it goes, and because I don't consider what I do R&D, but it kind of is, and it's out of need to do something that's different than what others are used to seeing. I often get called in to do these um, there's a champion model, and we want to see if you can beat it type thing. And to beat it, I can't do what they did. I get the same results. So I have to, think about and pull in all my knowledge. Now, what can I do differently? And that's how I came in the top 10 twice in the DMA analytical challenge. Not because I was smarter than everybody. I didn't even have a team. It was just me. But I thought about what the problem was and how best to solve it. And it kind of worked out for me. So, my message is to anyone, you got to think, we're talking about a cliche, think outside the box, but nobody really does, right?
yeah.
Otherwise, we wouldn't have just a bunch of average.
Yeah, and there's something you said between the lines there, which is the most important thing is you've got to have the confidence to think that you can actually do it and have the desire. And frankly, I think confidence is the biggest thing lacking, even at the
Yeah,
senior executive level. Now, and the VC thing is interesting because there again, I think you hit on a key point, whereas your risk strategy is different if you have a portfolio versus if you're a single company. And unfortunately, tech CEOs and non-tech CEOs think that they should design their risk strategy in the same way that a VC does, but you only have one unit. And so
right.
if you just start giving away a product without a way to then figure out how you're going to go to the next step beyond your entry level pricing, you're dead. And we've seen this
Yep,
firsthand together, right?
yep,
So, and of course, I think that the one thing that's being implied between the lines is that there are also academics and scientists who get it and who are intuitive, but they're few and far in between, and those are the ones we want to really work with.
yep.
But I want to touch on attribution a little bit here,
Hmm.
because to me it seems as though attribution is often used as an excuse to not innovate because if we offer a new way to do prediction, and then of course it has to be accepted organizationally, and for that, frankly, Andy, I think the next generation CEO has to think like we do, right? Your CEO has to intuit applied mathematics in some way, form, or fashion, even if
Yep,
he can't build the models. Otherwise, you're going to go in circles. Engineers are not scientists. Now, there are many tech VPs who are engineers who will publicly admit they're not scientists. They'll say,
mhm.
we're not scientists. But they never change the action, which is that the technology is leading the science, and that's backward.
That's
So,
right.
and so prediction comes before attribution because look, if I can predict who's going to buy my product, even if I can't attribute it, that's better than attributing it and nobody's buying my product. So to
Yeah.
me, attribution is a part of your prediction strategy. And I know you work on attribution, it's really something everybody talks about. What are your thoughts on balancing the need for innovation, prediction, and attribution? And kind of how do you evolve that over time and not let the lack of perfection get in the way of progress?
Well, I never really worried about lack of perfection because when you're doing something new, it's not going to be perfect. It gets like everything, the wrinkles come out over time. But on the other hand, trying to be perfect means you're average. You know, you're not, if there's not wrinkles, then there's something wrong. But that's just my opinion. But I will live and die by that one. Um, so, you take attribution and, happy to have a project and do that. Interesting, as you said, I thought I was like last to the dance on attribution. It turns out I may have been the first to the dance. Everyone talked about it, but few really knew how to do it. So it's the old, like, let me read the Harvard Business Review. Now I'm an expert. No, you're not. You got to go out and live the thing. And yeah, you've seen it too. So, I remember when I was first looking at attribution, and we'll probably circle around or somehow through what I say, you'll read between the lines again and pull it together for me. But it struck me that, as a, first and foremost marketing executive, that it's well and all that you can attribute, that some event took place because, these are the events you're tracking and something, and so now you've made a leap in faith that the things you were doing, were the deciding factor. The fact of the matter is, what's in a cookie? Not much. It's basically a broken out campaign code. It's like doing A/B testing. You haven't gone into any of the psychographics or demographics or anything, nor is there a way to link it. So to what I said earlier, if you're really trying to mimic how the brain thinks, then attribution isn't even, isn't even a pinhead in the big picture of trying to understand, what the driving forces were behind a decision to make something. So it's basically serving as a proxy, but you really don't know what drove it.
Yeah.
It also is complicated, and so you find that a lot don't do it because they don't understand it. And that's sad. To your point, and I fully support your point about whether CEOs like it or not. If this is the way the world's going, especially theirs, then it's incumbent on them to learn something about it. That way, they can, like you and I have had to, distinguish, fact from fiction and what we're being told either by IT or other people, or by IBM. IBM's a really good example I wanted to bring up because a few years ago, I was involved in the beta of Watson. And at the time, they were running ads all over TV and everything. And I asked them simple questions about models. And at the time, they admitted that their SPSS product, because they had just bought it, was actually better than Watson for everyday use because it couldn't do most of what SPSS did. And I'm sitting there like, even IBM. And the reason I mention that, I can't tell you how many projects I lost out on because I'm a small boutique consultancy with big league experience. But the typical comeback was, we know you can do it, but if it doesn't go well, I can always look at my boss or the board and say, well, it was IBM, how would I know him? But if you mess up, like they'd say, why'd you hire him? It was IBM. I get it.
Yeah.
But here, there's a common theme there. It keeps coming back to, that mediocre middle that you and I talk about a lot.
Yeah, it's as a former IBMer, I certainly lived that. And I think
I thought
we
I'd
admitted,
sneak that in,
yeah,
as
we
many of
admitted,
my ex-colleagues are, and they'll hate me
yeah.
for that.
But it goes back to if you're a CEO and you don't have chutzpah, if you don't have chutzpah, you shouldn't be in the seat, right? And so it's a
Right.
very simple thing. Look, just take a small percentage of your capital and allocate it to what you consider politically risky, and just that's an easy enough thing to sell to the board. Frankly, Andy, you knew when we first met, I was a younger man, and having hobnobbed and been part of the senior executive circles, I can't say that I ever expected this much emotional insecurity at the top
Yeah.
levels of most organizations. With a false projection of confidence, as you know, when you have a company that's really run well, the higher up you go in the chain, the more friendly and kind of nice and personable people are, and it's the opposite when you are in most companies. In any case, I think this has been great for me because it's really just been an unstructured conversation. We didn't have any notes,
No.
and your cookie point reminded me of what one of my best teachers I ever had in life used to say. Mrs. Harding, who was my 11th grade honors history teacher. And she would say that if you're going to make an argument, it's like oatmeal. You got to make sure you have a lot of raisins in there. Don't just serve me up some oatmeal. And so, I'd love to do this again in the near future. And by the way, please tell the audience a little bit more about, the work that you're doing and how they can reach you, and what are the kinds of projects and companies that you work with.
Sure. Thanks. Yeah, I founded a company named Effect Analytics, and the word effect was really meaningful because it all talks about affecting change in business. And that's what I try to do. And worked with a lot of different industries. Most I have no background in, and I say that in particular because it really doesn't matter, because the data itself doesn't know your company, doesn't know anything about it. What I do is take a little bit of time to learn about some of your, company-specific pain points, but we build models around that. In fact, I just did one for the History Channel to predict viewership this past year. It was called Project Blue Book, and I was able to show them they weren't going to hit their projected viewership because I analyzed everything they were doing on all social medias, and guess what? They didn't meet it. So I use that as an example. As if you have a particular problem, I'm sort of known as I might not have the initial idea, but I can certainly bring your idea to life. I'm really good at figuring things out, and our business has done very well doing interesting things that no one else is doing. Lately, particularly in the healthcare industry, where they've got lots of problems there, and I'm trying to help them solve them, and so we've got some good things going there. So you can reach me at arusso@effectanalytics.com. Feel free to reach out to me. I'm on LinkedIn as well. Not here trying to promote and ask for business. I'm always happy to have it, but I'm certainly happy as a practitioner, as Sunil is, to have a dialogue with you, because I think we both find this pretty interesting, and the more people that see things our way, the better for us.
Yeah, and the better for them. And by the way, I'm glad you explained to me the reason for calling it affect, because I thought it was based on your penchant for having affect in conversation. So now I
Yeah.
know. All right, thanks, Andy. Hopefully, we get a chance to do this again sometime in the near future.
Yeah, I
But
really enjoyed this, Sunil, and I'd certainly love to do it. When you think I have some value to add.
well, that is pretty frequent. And in the meantime, enjoy the Florida sunshine, and I'll catch up with you soon.
I'll do that. Take care.
Take care.
Yeah.